Sarah Mitchell settled into her window seat with a tired sigh. The fabric felt rough against her cheek as she leaned toward the small oval window. Outside, the airport workers in their bright orange vests moved like tiny ants across the tarmac. Flight 287 to Denver was supposed to leave at 6 in the morning, but mechanical delays had pushed departure to nearly 9. Sarah had been awake since 3, dragging herself through the dark streets of Boston to catch what she hoped would be a smooth journey home. Row 10, Seat A. Sarah always picked window seats. She liked watching the world shrink below her, turning highways into ribbons and buildings into toy blocks. But today, exhaustion weighed on her like a heavy blanket. Her eyes felt scratchy and dry. The business conference in Boston had drained every ounce of her energy over the past 4 days. Presentations, networking, dinners, forced smiles with strangers who only cared about quarterly profits and market projections. The middle seat next to her remained empty, a small blessing. The aisle seat held a businessman already absorbed in his laptop, fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. He wore a crisp gray suit and barely acknowledged her presence when he sat down. Sarah appreciated people who kept to themselves on flights. She had no interest in small talk or learning about someone's grandchildren or vacation plans. The flight attendants moved through the cabin doing their safety checks. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and silver streaks in her dark hair, paused at Sarah's row. Her name tag read, Jennifer Martinez. "Good morning. Can I get you anything before we take off?" Jennifer asked with a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Just some water, please," Sarah replied, managing a weak smile in return. Jennifer nodded and returned moments later with a small plastic cup filled with ice water. Sarah accepted it gratefully, the cold liquid soothing her dry throat. She noticed Jennifer had a small pin on her uniform jacket shaped like a pair of wings. It looked old, possibly vintage. As the plane began to taxi toward the runway, Sarah pulled out her phone for one last check of messages. 3 texts from her husband Mike asking if she was boarding yet. 1 from her daughter Emma reminding her about the school play next Friday. Sarah typed quick responses, promising she would be home by dinner and wouldn't miss the play for anything in the world. The phone went into airplane mode just as the captain's voice crackled through the speakers. "Good morning, folks. This is Captain Robert Hayes speaking. Sorry about the delay this morning. We had a minor hydraulic issue that the maintenance crew has fully resolved. Weather looks clear all the way to Denver. Should be a smooth ride. We'll have you on the ground in about 3.5 hours. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." His voice sounded confident and calm. Sarah felt herself relax slightly. She had flown dozens of times for work, but something about hearing the captain's voice always made the experience feel safer. Like having a skilled driver behind the wheel of a car. The engines roared to life with that familiar whine that made Sarah's stomach flutter. She pressed her face closer to the window, watching the ground begin to move past them. Faster and faster, until the wheels lifted and Boston fell away below. The buildings grew smaller. The harbor glittered in the morning sun like scattered diamonds. Then they were surrounded by clouds, white and puffy like cotton candy. Sarah closed her eyes. Just for a moment, she told herself. Just to rest them. The hum of the engines created a soothing white noise that wrapped around her like a cocoon. Her head tilted against the window, finding that uncomfortable but somehow perfect spot that airplane travelers know well. The plastic shade was cool against her forehead. Sleep came quickly, pulling her down into that strange half-conscious state where sounds from the cabin mixed with dreams. She dreamed about the conference, about standing at a podium, giving her presentation while everyone in the audience slowly turned into birds. Their heads tilted at odd angles, and they chirped instead of asking questions. Sarah tried to explain her marketing strategies to a room full of pigeons and sparrows. Time passed in that fluid, unmeasurable way it does during airplane naps. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness. Once, she woke briefly to hear the drink cart rattling past. The businessman next to her ordered tomato juice. Sarah found that odd but didn't comment. She let sleep reclaim her. The plane hit turbulence about 40 minutes into the flight. Nothing serious, just enough bumps to make the seatbelt light ding on. Sarah stirred but didn't fully wake. In her drowsy state, she heard the flight attendants moving to their seats. The captain's voice came on again, saying something about rough air and staying seated. Sarah's consciousness registered the information but didn't process it. She simply adjusted her position and let herself sink deeper into sleep. She dreamed about home, about her yellow kitchen with the cracked tile Mike kept promising to fix, about Emma's art projects covering the refrigerator door like colorful stamps, about the old maple tree in their backyard that shed leaves every autumn like golden rain. Comfort dreams. Safe dreams. The kind that make waking up feel like a disappointment. Nearly 2 hours into the flight, Sarah finally stirred properly. Her neck ached from the awkward angle. Her mouth felt dry and tasted stale. She blinked several times, trying to orient herself. The businessman was still typing away, now wearing wireless headphones. Jennifer passed by with a trash bag, collecting empty cups and snack wrappers. Sarah glanced at her watch. They should be about halfway to Denver now. She considered getting up to use the restroom, but the thought of standing felt like too much effort. Her body still craved more rest. Just another few minutes, she bargained with herself. Just until they started the descent. She was about to close her eyes again when she noticed something odd. Jennifer had stopped at the front of the cabin and was speaking urgently into the phone mounted near the galley. Her face had changed. The kind smile was gone, replaced by tight lines of concern. Another flight attendant, a younger man with neat blonde hair, joined her. They spoke in hushed tones, but Sarah could see tension in their body language. Other passengers began noticing too. A woman across the aisle craned her neck to see what was happening. The businessman next to Sarah finally looked up from his laptop, sensing the shift in cabin atmosphere. That invisible thing that happens on planes when something feels wrong, when the routine breaks and uncertainty creeps in. Sarah sat up straighter. Fully awake now. Her heart began beating faster. That primitive response to danger that humans can never quite suppress. Jennifer and the male flight attendant were now opening overhead compartments near the front, searching for something. Their movements were quick but controlled, professional even in their obvious urgency. Then the captain's voice returned to the speakers. But this time, it sounded different, strained. The confidence was still there, but underneath it, Sarah heard something else. Something that made her stomach clench with sudden fear. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Hayes. I need everyone to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say. The cabin went completely silent. Even the baby that had been fussing 3 rows back went quiet, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Sarah gripped the armrest, her knuckles turning white. "We have a medical emergency on board," the captain continued. His words came measured and deliberate. "I need to know immediately if there are any medical professionals on this flight. Any doctors, nurses, paramedics, or EMTs, please identify yourselves to the flight attendants right away. This is extremely urgent." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A medical emergency. On a plane. Trapped 30,000 feet in the air with nowhere to go, no hospital to rush to, no ambulance to call. The isolation of their situation hit her like a physical blow. They were in a metal tube hurtling through the sky, and someone needed help that the flight attendants apparently couldn't provide alone. Jennifer was now moving quickly down the aisle, her eyes scanning faces with desperate hope. Is anyone here a doctor? A nurse? Any medical training at all? The cabin erupted in murmurs. Passengers turned to each other, shaking heads. Sarah heard someone behind her say they took a CPR class once, but that was years ago. Another person mentioned being a veterinarian, but wasn't sure if that counted. The businessman next to Sarah stood up, craning to see toward the back of the plane, where a small crowd was forming. "What's happening?" someone called out. "Who's sick?" another voice asked. Jennifer reached Sarah's row, and their eyes met for just a moment. Sarah saw real fear there. The kind of fear that comes when someone with training and experience encounters a situation beyond their control. It made Sarah's blood run cold. "Please," Jennifer said loudly enough for several rows to hear. "We need medical help right now. Someone is in serious distress." Sarah wanted to help but had no medical training whatsoever. Her expertise lay in marketing strategies and brand development, utterly useless in this moment. She felt helpless and small. Around her, other passengers were experiencing the same uncomfortable realization that most people have nothing to offer in a true medical crisis, except hopes and prayers. Then, From about 5 rows back, a woman stood up. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with auburn hair pulled into a practical ponytail. She wore jeans and a simple blue sweater. Nothing about her appearance suggested medical training, but she raised her hand with clear authority. "I'm a nurse," she called out firmly. "Emergency department. Let me through." Relief flooded Jennifer's face. "Thank God. Come quickly, please." The nurse moved swiftly down the aisle, her movements confident and purposeful. Passengers shifted to let her pass, pressing themselves against seat backs and pulling their legs in. Sarah watched her go by, noticing the determined set of her jaw. This was someone who had seen emergencies before, who knew how to function when others panicked. But then Jennifer called out again, her voice carrying a note of desperation. "Anyone else? We need more help. Any other medical professionals?" The terrible implications settled over the cabin like a dark cloud. Whatever was happening must be serious if one nurse wasn't enough. Sarah felt her chest tighten with anxiety. She glanced out the window at the vast emptiness below them. Clouds stretched endlessly in all directions. They were truly alone up here, far from any help. Another passenger stood, an older man with gray hair and glasses. "I'm a retired paramedic," he said gruffly. "I can assist." "Yes, please. Come with me," Jennifer said, already moving toward the back of the plane. The paramedic followed, his movements slower but steady. Sarah and the other passengers watched them disappear toward the rear galley. The businessman next to Sarah had taken off his headphones completely now. His laptop sat forgotten, screen dimming to black. "Do you know what's going on?" he asked Sarah quietly. She shook her head. No idea. But both of them, along with everyone else in the cabin, could imagine plenty of scenarios. Heart attack, stroke, allergic reaction, seizure. The possibilities raced through Sarah's mind, each more frightening than the last. And underneath it all, one terrible question. What if they couldn't be saved? What if someone was going to die on this plane, and there was nothing anyone could do about it? The captain's voice returned, cutting through the anxious murmurs. "Folks, I need everyone to remain calm and stay in your seats. We have medical professionals attending to the situation. Flight attendants, please clear the aisles and prepare for possible emergency landing procedures." Emergency landing. The word sent a fresh wave of panic through the cabin. Sarah felt her hands begin to tremble. An emergency landing meant things were serious enough that they couldn't wait to reach Denver. It meant finding the nearest airport and getting on the ground as fast as safely possible. She looked out the window again, trying to guess where they might be. Somewhere over the Midwest, probably. Flat farmland stretched below, divided into neat squares of brown and green. Small towns appeared as tiny clusters of buildings connected by thin roads. Where would they land? What kind of facilities would be available? Jennifer returned to the front of the cabin, moving with controlled urgency. She picked up the PA handset and spoke in a voice that trembled slightly, despite her obvious efforts to remain professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be making an unscheduled landing. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and your seatbacks and tray tables are in their upright positions. Place any loose items in the seat pocket or under the seat in front of you." The routine instructions felt surreal given the circumstances. Sarah mechanically checked her seatbelt, even though it was already fastened. The businessman did the same. Around them, passengers were doing what humans do in crisis situations. Some pulled out their phones despite the airplane mode requirement, needing to feel connected to loved ones. Others sat frozen, staring straight ahead. A few prayed quietly, lips moving without sound. Sarah thought about Mike and Emma. If something went wrong during the landing, if something catastrophic happened, would they know how much she loved them? Had she said it enough? Shown it enough? The thoughts came unwanted but insistent, the way mortality suddenly becomes real when danger feels close. Minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Sarah could hear activity at the back of the plane, but couldn't see anything. Voices speaking urgently, but not quite loud enough to make out words. Equipment being moved. The nurse and paramedic doing whatever medical professionals do when someone's life hangs in the balance and all they have are the limited supplies in an airplane's first aid kit. The plane began to descend. Sarah felt the change in her ears. That pressure that makes you want to yawn or swallow. The engines changed pitch slightly. Through her window, she saw the ground slowly growing closer. They were definitely heading down faster than a normal descent. Not dangerously fast, but with purpose, with urgency. "We're diverting to Lincoln Regional Airport in Nebraska," the captain announced. "We'll be on the ground in approximately 12 minutes. Emergency medical services are standing by. I need everyone to stay calm and follow all instructions from the flight attendants." 12 minutes felt like an eternity. Sarah pressed her face against the window, watching the landscape rush up to meet them. Nebraska spread out below in endless fields of wheat and corn, broken occasionally by farmhouses and winding country roads. She could make out individual trees now, their shadows long in the morning sun. The cabin had fallen into an eerie quiet. The usual chatter and movement of a flight had been replaced by tense silence. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting. The woman across the aisle gripped a small cross necklace, her lips moving in silent prayer. Behind Sarah, someone was crying softly. The sound made her throat tighten with emotion. Jennifer and the male flight attendant moved through the cabin one final time, checking seatbelts and making sure everyone was prepared for landing. When Jennifer reached Sarah's row, Sarah couldn't help herself. "Is the person going to be okay?" she asked quietly. Jennifer's professional mask slipped for just a moment. Sarah saw exhaustion and worry in her eyes. "We're doing everything we can," she said simply. Then her expression firmed back into that trained flight attendant composure. "Make sure your seatbelt is tight, please." Sarah adjusted the belt, pulling it snug across her lap. Her hands were still shaking slightly. The businessman next to her had his eyes closed, though Sarah doubted he was sleeping. More likely praying or trying to center himself, she understood the impulse. The plane banked slightly, lining up with the runway. Sarah could see Lincoln now, a modest city rising from the farmland. Not huge like Boston or Denver, but substantial enough. She spotted the airport, a relatively small facility with a single main terminal. On the tarmac below, she could make out flashing lights, ambulances, fire trucks, emergency vehicles positioned and waiting. The sight made everything feel more real and more frightening. Those vehicles were there because someone on this plane desperately needed them. Someone who had boarded in Boston this morning expecting a routine flight, just like Sarah, only to have their body betray them at the worst possible moment. "Cabin crew, prepare for landing," the captain's voice instructed. The flight attendants took their jump seats, strapping in with practiced efficiency. Sarah noticed Jennifer looking toward the back of the plane, her expression troubled. Whatever was happening back there, it clearly wasn't over. The medical emergency was still ongoing, still critical, and they were about to land with a sick passenger and limited resources. The ground rushed up. Sarah saw individual cars on the highway, a tractor in a field, a water tower with the town's name painted on the side. Then they were over the runway, and the wheels touched down with a slight bounce. The engines roared as the captain deployed the reverse thrusters, slowing their speed. Sarah was pressed forward slightly against her seatbelt. The plane slowed, turned, and began taxiing. But instead of heading toward the terminal, they moved to a remote area of the tarmac where the emergency vehicles were gathered. Through her window, Sarah counted 3 ambulances, 2 fire trucks, and several other official-looking vehicles with lights flashing red and blue. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've landed safely in Lincoln," Captain Hayes announced. His voice carried obvious relief but remained serious. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Emergency medical personnel will be boarding immediately. We need to keep the aisles completely clear. Do not stand up or retrieve your belongings until we give you clearance. This is critical." The plane came to a complete stop. Through her window, Sarah watched EMTs and paramedics rushing toward them, carrying equipment, stretchers, medical bags, oxygen tanks. The door at the front of the plane opened with a pressurized hiss, and suddenly the cabin was filled with purposeful activity. The emergency responders moved through the plane with impressive speed and coordination. Sarah caught glimpses of uniforms, heard urgent professional voices. "Coming through. Make way, please. We need room to work." The passengers pressed themselves back, creating as much space as possible in the narrow aisle. More medical personnel moved past Sarah's row, heading toward the back. She counted at least 8 emergency responders, maybe more. That seemed like a lot for one person. unless the situation was extremely serious. Unless they were trying to save a life that was slipping away despite everyone's best efforts. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Sarah and the other passengers sat in suspended animation, belted into their seats, unable to see what was happening but hearing everything. Voices calling out medical terms she didn't understand. Equipment being moved. Someone asking for a specific medication. The sounds painted a picture of intense medical intervention happening just a few rows away. The businessman next to Sarah leaned over slightly and whispered, "I hope they make it." "Me too," Sarah replied, surprised to feel tears pricking at her eyes. She didn't even know who the sick passenger was. Man or woman, young or old, traveling alone or with family. But suddenly it mattered deeply that this stranger survive, that this person get to see their loved ones again, finish whatever journey they were on, live more of their life. After what felt like forever but was probably only 10 minutes, movement began at the back of the plane. Sarah heard the EMTs saying they were ready to move. The stretcher appeared in the aisle, rolled carefully by multiple responders. Sarah caught a brief glimpse as it passed her row. The person on the stretcher appeared to be a woman, middle-aged, with an oxygen mask covering most of her face. Her eyes were closed. She looked pale, frighteningly still. Medical equipment surrounded her, and 2 EMTs kept their hands on her, monitoring, checking, staying vigilant. The nurse who had responded earlier walked alongside the stretcher, still helping, still involved in the care, even as professional emergency services had taken over. The stretcher moved past, and Sarah realized she had been holding her breath. She exhaled shakily. The woman had looked so vulnerable, so fragile. Life could change in an instant. You could board a plane feeling fine and end up fighting for survival before landing. The randomness of it was terrifying. Behind the stretcher came another passenger, a man in his 50s with tears streaming down his face. He moved quickly, trying to keep up, his hand reaching out toward the stretcher, as if wanting to touch the woman but not daring to interfere with the medical team. His grief and fear were palpable, filling the cabin like a physical presence. "That must be her husband," the businessman murmured. Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She watched the man stumble slightly as he walked, and Jennifer immediately moved to support his elbow, helping him toward the door. The compassion in that simple gesture made Sarah's tears finally spill over. The emergency responders carried the stretcher down the aircraft stairs and across the tarmac to the waiting ambulance. Even from her window seat, Sarah could see the urgency in their movements. The husband climbed into the ambulance with them. Within seconds, the doors slammed shut, the sirens wailed to life, and the ambulance sped away across the tarmac toward the road. Sarah watched until it disappeared from view, then slumped back in her seat, feeling emotionally drained. Around her, other passengers were having similar reactions. Some were crying openly. Others sat in stunned silence. The woman with the cross necklace was still praying, now with her eyes closed and hands clasped tightly. Captain Hayes's voice returned to the speakers, and this time Sarah could hear the exhaustion in his tone. "Folks, thank you for your patience and cooperation during this emergency. The passenger has been transported to Lincoln Medical Center, where they'll receive the care they need. I want to personally thank the medical professionals who volunteered to help. You may have saved a life today." A spontaneous round of applause erupted in the cabin. Passengers clapped for the nurse and retired paramedic who had responded, for the flight attendants who had managed the crisis, for the pilots who had gotten them safely on the ground, for the EMTs who had taken over. It was the kind of applause that comes from relief and gratitude, and the strange bond that forms between strangers who have shared a frightening experience. The nurse who had helped appeared from the back of the plane, making her way forward. She looked exhausted, her ponytail now messy, her blue sweater wrinkled. But she also looked satisfied, like someone who had done difficult work and done it well. As she passed Sarah's row, their eyes met, and Sarah mouthed, "Thank you." The nurse gave a small, tired smile in return. "We're going to refuel here in Lincoln," the captain announced. "Our original destination was Denver, and we'll continue there once we're cleared for takeoff. However, if any passengers need to remain in Lincoln for any reason, the airline will make arrangements. We expect to be on the ground for approximately 90 minutes. You may use the terminal facilities, but please stay close. We'll announce when we're ready to reboard." The seatbelt sign finally dinged off. The cabin erupted in movement as passengers stood, stretched, and began collecting their belongings. But the mood remained subdued. People spoke in hushed tones, still processing what had happened. Sarah grabbed her purse from under the seat in front of her and stood on shaky legs. The businessman extended his hand. "That was intense," he said simply. Sarah shook his hand. "Yeah, really puts things in perspective. Makes you grateful for boring flights," he agreed with a weak smile. They shuffled forward with the other passengers, moving slowly down the aisle toward the exit. As Sarah stepped off the plane and onto the stairs leading to the tarmac, the Nebraska air hit her face. It was warmer than Boston, with a dry quality that felt foreign. The sun was bright and harsh after the dim cabin lighting. Inside the small Lincoln terminal, passengers from Flight 287 clustered in groups, talking about what had happened. Airport staff had set up a small area with coffee and water, a gesture of hospitality for the unexpected visitors. Sarah grabbed a bottle of water and found a seat near a window overlooking the tarmac. She pulled out her phone and turned off airplane mode. Immediately, messages began flooding in. More texts from Mike, growing concern that her flight wasn't showing as landed in Denver. Sarah called him, needing to hear his voice. "Sarah, where are you? Flight tracker shows you landed in Nebraska?" Mike sounded confused and worried. "I'm fine," Sarah assured him quickly. "There was a medical emergency on the plane. Another passenger got really sick, and we had to make an emergency landing. But I'm okay. We're all okay." She heard Mike's sharp intake of breath. Jesus, that must have been scary. "It was," Sarah admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "Mike, this woman just collapsed or something. They had to call for doctors, and we had to land so fast. There were ambulances and everything. She looked so sick." "But you're okay?" Mike asked again, needing the reassurance. "I'm okay, I promise. We're just waiting to refuel. And then we'll fly to Denver. I'll probably be a few hours late getting home, but I'll be there." They talked for a few more minutes, with Sarah describing what had happened in more detail. Just telling the story helped process it, made it feel more real, and less like a nightmare. Mike listened patiently, making sympathetic sounds and asking questions. When they finally hung up, Sarah felt slightly better. She noticed Jennifer sitting alone at the other end of the gate area, her head in her hands. The flight attendant looked completely drained. Sarah considered going over to say something, but wasn't sure what would be appropriate. "Thank you" seemed inadequate. "Are you okay?" felt intrusive. Before she could decide, another flight attendant joined Jennifer, putting a comforting arm around her shoulders. Sarah checked news on her phone, wondering if the emergency landing would make headlines. She found a brief mention on a local Lincoln news site. "Commercial flight makes emergency landing at Lincoln Regional due to medical situation. Passenger transported to Lincoln Medical Center. Flight expected to continue to Denver." Just a few sentences that couldn't capture the drama and fear and humanity of what had actually happened. Time passed slowly. Sarah walked around the small terminal, bought a stale sandwich from a vending machine that she couldn't quite bring herself to eat, and watched other flights take off and land through the windows. Normal flights with normal passengers having normal days. She envied them their ordinary experiences. Eventually, an announcement came over the terminal speakers. "Passengers of Flight 287 to Denver, we're ready to begin boarding. Please make your way to Gate 3. The group of passengers shuffled back toward the gate, most looking reluctant to return to the plane. Sarah understood the feeling. The aircraft felt different now, marked by what had happened. But they had little choice. Their belongings were still on board, and more importantly, they all needed to reach their destinations. Sarah made her way back to row 10, seat A. Her window spot waited exactly as she had left it, but she felt like a different person than the exhausted woman who had dozed off hours earlier. That woman had been focused on her own tiredness, her own discomfort, her own small problems. Now, Sarah felt raw and aware of how fragile everything was. As passengers settled back into their seats, Sarah noticed several empty spots in the cabin. A few people had chosen to stay in Lincoln, either too shaken to continue flying or needing to make alternative travel arrangements. The businessman returned to the aisle seat next to Sarah, but he looked different now. more human, somehow. The corporate armor had been stripped away by shared crisis. "Crazy morning," he said as he buckled in. "That's one way to put it," Sarah replied. They sat in companionable silence as the other passengers boarded. Sarah noticed people glancing toward the back of the plane, toward the row where the sick woman had been sitting. That space felt haunted now, marked by absence. The seat had been cleaned, the area tidied, but everyone knew what had happened there. A woman had been sitting there, just another passenger, and then suddenly she wasn't. Suddenly her life hung in the balance while strangers fought to save her. Jennifer appeared at the front of the cabin, her professional composure restored, but with shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there that morning. She picked up the PA handset and addressed the passengers. "On behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you all again for your cooperation during our emergency. I know that was frightening and stressful for everyone. We appreciate your patience." She paused, and Sarah saw her swallow hard. "I also want to address something I'm sure many of you are wondering about. We have received word from Lincoln Medical Center. The passenger we transported is currently stable and receiving treatment. Her prognosis is guarded but hopeful." Relief swept through the cabin like a physical wave. Passengers exhaled audibly. Someone behind Sarah whispered, "Thank God." The woman with the cross necklace pressed her hand to her heart and closed her eyes. The businessman next to Sarah nodded slowly, his jaw tight with emotion. Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes again. Stable, hopeful. Those words meant the woman was still alive, still fighting. The emergency landing had been worth it. The quick actions of the nurse and paramedic and EMTs had made a difference. That stranger would see another day, would have another chance, would hopefully recover and return to whatever life she had been traveling toward or away from. Jennifer continued. "We don't have specific details about her condition out of privacy concerns, but the family has authorized us to share that update. We expect to be airborne again shortly. Thank you all." As Jennifer returned to her duties, conversations broke out across the cabin. Passengers who hadn't spoken before suddenly felt compelled to share their reactions, to process what they had witnessed together. The crisis had broken down the usual airplane walls that keep people isolated in their individual bubbles of silence. The woman across the aisle from Sarah leaned over. She appeared to be in her 60s, with silver hair and warm brown eyes. "I couldn't stop thinking about her husband," she said softly. "Did you see his face?" Sarah nodded. He looked devastated. "Made me think about my own husband," the woman continued. "We've been married 42 years. If something happened to me when we were traveling." She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "They'll get through this," Sarah said, wanting to believe it. "The doctors will help her." "I hope so, dear. I really do." The woman smiled sadly. "I'm Margaret, by the way." Seemed silly, we've been sitting across from each other all morning without introducing ourselves. "Sarah," she replied, returning the smile. "Heading to Denver?" "Eventually, visiting my daughter and new grandbaby." "You?" "Going home. I live there." They chatted easily for a few minutes, finding comfort in normal conversation after the abnormal events. Sarah learned that Margaret had 3 children and 7 grandchildren, that she loved gardening but couldn't grow decent tomatoes to save her life, that she was nervous about flying but her excitement to meet her newest grandson had overridden her fear. In return, Sarah shared about Emma's upcoming school play, about Mike's work as a high school teacher, about her own job in marketing that required too much travel. The conversation felt precious in a way that normal small talk never did. They were 2 strangers who had shared something profound, who had been reminded together that life was uncertain and should be treasured. Margaret's gardening problems and Sarah's work stress suddenly seemed less important, but also more important. These were the details of actual lives being lived, not taken for granted. Captain Hayes' voice returned to the speakers as the plane began to taxi. "Folks, we've been cleared for takeoff. Should have you in Denver in about an hour and 15 minutes. I know today has been unusual to say the least, and I want to personally thank each of you for your grace under pressure. This crew is honored to have served passengers like you. Let's get you all home." The plane lifted off from Lincoln's runway, climbing back into the Nebraska sky. Sarah watched the small city fall away below, saw the hospital somewhere down there where a woman she had never met was fighting for her health. She silently sent hope and prayers down to that stranger, willing her to survive to recover, to live. The flight to Denver passed in a strange, contemplative atmosphere. The usual restlessness that overtakes passengers was absent. People seemed content to sit quietly with their thoughts. Some dozed, but Sarah noticed they slept differently than before, less deeply, more aware, as if everyone was subconsciously staying alert in case another emergency arose. Sarah couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying the morning's events. The captain's emergency call that had jolted her awake, the fear in Jennifer's eyes, the nurse rushing to help, the ambulance speeding away with lights flashing, the husband's tears. She thought about how she had been just another dozing traveler in row 10, wrapped up in her own exhaustion and minor discomforts, completely unaware that someone nearby was about to face a life-threatening crisis. She thought about Mike and Emma waiting for her at home, about how she would hug them tighter when she saw them, hold them longer, appreciate them more fully, about how she would stop complaining about the small things and start noticing the gift of ordinary moments. At least, she hoped she would remember these lessons once the shock wore off and normal life resumed. The businessman worked on his laptop again, but periodically he would stop and stare into space, clearly processing his own reactions. At one point, he glanced at Sarah and said, "Makes you think about priorities, doesn't it?" "Yeah," Sarah agreed. "Really does. I was annoyed this morning about the mechanical delay," he admitted. "Thinking about how it would throw off my schedule, make me late to a meeting that honestly isn't that important. Seems pretty stupid now." Sarah nodded. "I was exhausted and grumpy about the conference. Couldn't wait to just get home and collapse. But now I'm thinking about how that woman probably just wanted to get wherever she was going to, and instead she ended up in an ambulance." "Life's weird," the businessman said philosophically. Then he extended his hand formally. "I'm David, by the way." "Sarah." They shook hands for the second time that day, but this handshake felt more significant than the first. "What do you do, David?" "Financial consulting, bore people with spreadsheets and market analyses," he smiled wryly. "You?" "Marketing, bore people with brand strategies and consumer insights." They laughed, the sound feeling good after the tension of the morning. They talked about their work, their families, their lives. David had 2 teenage sons who were driving him crazy with their refusal to clean their rooms. His wife taught elementary school and had the patience of a saint. He had been traveling for a client meeting that, in light of the day's events, seemed trivial. As they talked, Sarah realized this was what people did after brushes with mortality. They connected, they shared, they reminded themselves, and each other, that life was full of relationships and meaning beyond the endless tasks and obligations that usually consumed attention. The emergency had cracked open something in all of them, made them more willing to be vulnerable and authentic with strangers. The flight attendants came through with drinks and snacks, but their service felt different now too. More personal. Jennifer stopped at Sarah's row and asked if they were doing okay. Not the scripted, "Is there anything I can get you?" but a genuine check-in on their emotional state. "We're okay," Sarah assured her. "Thank you for everything you did today. You were amazing." Jennifer's eyes got bright with unshed tears. "Just doing my job, but thank you. It means a lot." She moved on quickly, probably not wanting to break down in front of passengers. The nurse who had responded to the emergency was seated several rows behind Sarah. During the flight, multiple passengers approached her to express gratitude. Sarah watched her accept the thanks with quiet dignity, deflecting praise and emphasizing that everyone had worked together. She seemed uncomfortable with the hero worship, but accepting of the gratitude. When they were about 30 minutes from Denver, Captain Hayes made one final announcement. "Folks, we're beginning our descent into Denver International Airport. I want to say one last time how impressed I've been with this group of passengers. In 23 years of flying, I've dealt with my share of emergencies, and I've never seen a calmer, more cooperative group of people. You should all be proud of how you handled yourselves today." He paused, and Sarah heard emotion in his voice when he continued. "Air travel can sometimes feel impersonal and dehumanizing. We're all just trying to get from point A to point B, focused on our own agendas. But today reminded me that we're all in this together. When crisis hits, people show their true character. And you all showed exceptional character. So from me and my crew, thank you. It's been an honor to fly with you." The cabin erupted in applause again, but this time it felt different. People were clapping for each other, for themselves, for the shared experience of facing something difficult and coming through it together. Sarah clapped until her hands hurt, feeling more connected to this random group of strangers than she had felt to colleagues she had spent 4 days with at the conference. Denver appeared on the horizon, the Rocky Mountains rising dramatically behind the city. Sarah had seen this view dozens of times, but today it looked more beautiful than she remembered. Maybe because it represented safety and completion, the end of a journey that had become much more than just a flight. Or maybe because she was looking at everything with fresh eyes, aware of how quickly normal could become extraordinary, how fragile the line was between routine and crisis. The plane descended smoothly, cutting through clouds and dropping toward the airport. Sarah watched the familiar landscape come into focus. The sprawling terminal with its distinctive white peaked roof, the highways crisscrossing around the airport, the neighborhoods spreading out into the distance. Home. She was almost home. The wheels touched down with barely a bump, and this time the landing felt triumphant. They had made it. Everyone had made it to their destination, albeit later and more emotionally raw than anyone had anticipated when boarding in Boston that morning. But they had arrived safely, and somewhere in Lincoln, a woman was fighting to recover with the help of skilled medical professionals who had been there because of quick thinking and decisive action. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers began gathering their belongings. But nobody seemed in a rush. People lingered, talking to neighbors they had connected with during the crisis. Contact information was exchanged. Promises to stay in touch were made. Margaret hugged Sarah before they parted, holding on tight for a moment. "You take care of yourself, dear," Margaret said. "Give that daughter and husband of yours extra hugs tonight." "I will," Sarah promised. "You enjoy that grandbaby." David shook Sarah's hand one last time. "Safe travels in the future. Hope your next flight is boring." "The most boring flight imaginable," Sarah agreed with a smile. When Sarah finally stepped off the plane, Jennifer was standing at the exit saying goodbye to passengers. Sarah stopped and looked her in the eye. "Thank you," she said simply, "for everything." Jennifer nodded, her professionalism finally cracking slightly. "Thank you for being one of the good ones. It made a huge difference." Sarah walked through the jetway and into the Denver terminal, joining the flow of passengers heading toward baggage claim. She felt exhausted, but also strangely energized, her mind racing with thoughts and realizations. She pulled out her phone and texted Mike that she had landed, that she would explain everything when she got home. At baggage claim, Sarah stood among her fellow Flight 287 passengers, waiting for luggage to appear on the carousel. They were easy to identify, still clustered together, still processing. A local news crew had somehow gotten word of the emergency landing and was conducting interviews with willing passengers. Sarah watched the nurse being interviewed, her auburn ponytail now completely disheveled, but her voice steady as she answered questions. "I just did what anyone with training would do," Sarah heard her say. "The real heroes are the flight attendants who managed everything so professionally, and the captain who got us on the ground safely, and the EMTs who took over care. It was a team effort." The nurse's humility impressed Sarah. Here was someone who had genuinely helped save a life, and she refused to take credit, instead spreading praise to everyone involved. That was real heroism, Sarah thought. Not seeking glory, but simply doing what needed to be done, and acknowledging that meaningful action always involves cooperation and community. Sarah's suitcase finally appeared on the carousel, and she grabbed it, eager to get home. But as she walked toward the exit, she took one last look at the group of passengers from Flight 287. They were still lingering, still talking, still processing. A shared trauma had bonded them in a way that would probably fade with time, but would never completely disappear. Years from now, they would remember this day. They would remember being scared together, and coming through it together. Outside, the Colorado sunshine felt warm on Sarah's face. She spotted Mike's car immediately and practically ran to it, dragging her suitcase behind her. Mike got out and wrapped her in a tight hug, holding on like he might never let go. "I'm so glad you're okay," he murmured into her hair. "Me too," Sarah said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Mike, it was so scary. But also, I don't know, profound somehow. Does that make sense?" "Tell me everything on the way home," Mike said. taking her suitcase and loading it into the trunk. During the drive, Sarah recounted the entire experience in detail. Mike listened intently, occasionally asking questions or making sympathetic sounds. When she described seeing the woman on the stretcher, her voice broke slightly. "I keep thinking about her," Sarah admitted. "About how she's doing, whether she'll fully recover, about her husband and what he must be going through." "You could try to find out," Mike suggested. "The hospital might have information, or maybe there will be news updates." Sarah nodded, already planning to search online when she got home. She felt invested in this stranger's outcome in a way that surprised her. They had shared a plane for a few hours, occupied the same small space suspended in the air. That somehow felt like enough to create a bond, or at least a sense of concern and care. When they pulled into their driveway, Emma burst out of the front door and ran to the car. At 14, she was usually too cool for enthusiastic displays of affection. But not today. She hugged Sarah fiercely. "Dad told me what happened," Emma said. "Are you really okay?" "I'm really okay, sweetheart," Sarah assured her, holding her daughter close and breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "Just tired and a little shaken up, but I'm fine." Inside, their house felt like a sanctuary. The yellow kitchen with its cracked tile, Emma's art projects on the refrigerator, the old maple tree visible through the window. All of it looked almost painfully beautiful to Sarah, precious in its ordinariness. This was what that woman in the hospital was fighting to get back to, Sarah thought. Her own version of home, whatever that looked like. Her own ordinary, precious life. Over dinner, Sarah told Emma the full story. Her daughter listened with wide eyes, asking questions and processing what it would feel like to be on a plane during an emergency. They talked about how quickly life could change, about the importance of helping others when possible, about gratitude for health and safety. That night, as Sarah lay in bed next to Mike, she couldn't stop thinking about the day. She pulled out her phone and searched for news about the emergency landing. She found a brief update on a Nebraska news site. Passenger from diverted flight showing signs of improvement at Lincoln Medical Center. Hospital officials optimistic about recovery. Showing signs of improvement, optimistic about recovery. Sarah felt relief wash over her. The woman was going to be okay. The nurse's quick response, the paramedics' assistance, the pilot's swift action, the EMT's skill had all combined to save a life. One person who might not have survived, had everyone not worked together, had instead been given another chance. Sarah set her phone aside and snuggled closer to Mike. His arm came around her automatically, and she rested her head on his shoulder. Tomorrow she would go back to work, back to meetings and presentations and the daily grind. Life would return to normal, and the intensity of today's emotions would fade. But something had shifted permanently. She had been reminded that every day was a gift, that ordinary moments were extraordinary, that strangers could become connected through shared experience, and that crisis revealed the best in people more often than the worst. She had boarded Flight 287 as just another dozing traveler in row 10, exhausted and grumpy, and focused on her own discomfort. She had deplaned as someone changed, more aware, more grateful, more attuned to the fragility and beauty of existence. All because a captain had made an emergency call, and a group of strangers had come together when it mattered most. Sarah closed her eyes, finally ready to sleep. But unlike the restless, escapist sleep she had sought on the plane that morning, this was the deep, peaceful sleep of someone who had been through something significant and survived. Someone who had witnessed human courage and compassion at 30,000 feet and come home changed for the better. Someone who had learned that even in crisis, especially in crisis, people could be remarkable,